Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker for today is Shri Saurabh Kamdar, Associate Partner, KPMG. He has led 200 plus management consulting assignments advising corporates, private equity firms, global pension funds, government, regulators, multilaterals, and banks. Shri Kamdar is a domain expert in energy and natural resources and infrastructure sectors. He has experience of working across a range of sectors: power, renewable energy, highways, ports, cement, steel, logistics, and so on. He has closely worked with stakeholders across the financial sector, across banks, mutual funds, insurers, and alternative investment funds. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. I think I have the tough task of matching up to a lot of speakers, Mr. Nair, Neha, Rupa, Anand, and Niranjan, who spoke, and of course Mr. Acharya who spoke just before me. So high expectations to match up to as the presentation gets loaded. Yeah, we have the deck, hopefully. Yeah, you'll be controlling the slides, or should I control? Yeah. Okay, so we move to the next slide. Yeah, the next one. Yeah. So if you look at the entire context of climate change, a lot of times we look at the risk perspective or the challenge perspective of it, but from a banking lens, from a financial sector lens, really it presents not just challenges but a bouquet of opportunities. Of course, the challenges in terms of the asset level challenges of climate risk, or the portfolio level risks, particularly in sectors such as conventional power, highways. I think there are really significant climate change related challenges. But when you look at the opportunity size, there are significant opportunities in funding the transition, also looking at newer segments and expanding in newer segments of growth, as well as developing customized products and solutions which meet the blended or climate finance requirements. So I think when one looks at the entire sphere of activities, it's really the both ways rather than one way. If I move to the next piece in terms of the total funding requirements, what is estimated is about $10 trillion of financing requirements. On the next slide, please. Next slide, please. Yeah, $10 trillion of total financing on an annual basis, about $210 billion. And of course, there are, like Mr. Nair mentioned, there are different estimates to this. Just in terms of the capital split, about 50% comes through debt, a balance from government financing as well as equity. If we see the split of some of the recent years where about $50 billion has been spent from an India lens perspective, largely it has been in the clean energy and the transportation space, and energy efficiency is another big chunk which has been emerging as a significant driver of clean tech investments and funding climate change. So if you look at the massive capital requirements which are there, it's a huge opportunity space for banks, and how financial sector can really leverage and scale up to the funding requirements at scale. Because the topic that which I have been asked to do justice with is the disclosures, compliance, and reporting. Moving gears, I think I'll just focus the next few minutes in terms of how the regulatory and reporting landscape has been and what really is the road ahead on it. So if you look at, and a lot of us are familiar with this, the left-hand side is really the way SEBI has mandated clearly in terms of 22-23 being the first year of mandatorily reporting reporting BRSR. 23-24 is the first year of mandatory top 150 companies going through reasonable assurance, and 24-25 where 250 companies will have to mandatorily report the value chain. So I think immense amount of reporting requirements for banks in particular, where reasonable assurance and value chain reporting are going to be material shifts for the banking world. And it's a real discussion points in terms of how banks adopt to the value chain reporting, because it, of course, procurement side is an easier one, but when you look at the loan book, I think from retail to corporate to MSMEs, I think the spread of loan book really presents challenges in terms of how data can be aggregated to the 75% threshold which SEBI has mandated. But I'll not spend time on this. This is something which is already out in the public domain, and likewise the RBI discussion paper clearly lays out the need for stress testing, TCFD aligned reporting, and developing climate finance solutions, particularly starting off with green deposits to name one. So I think a very strong, I think in global parlance, I think a relatively strong regulatory framework, progressive regulatory framework that India has had the privilege to in the developing space, and courtesy the strong regulatory guidance both from RBI and SEBI. However, the task is yet not complete. I think there's a lot to be done, and in the next few slides, what we try to evaluate is how the banking sphere is really scaling up to mandatory and voluntary requirements. If we move to the next piece. So of course, these are some of the voluntary requirements which I'll try and skip. But if I go to the comparison of 6 public sector banks and 6 private sector banks, on the next slide, please. Yeah. So this is really a comparison in terms of how public and private sector banks. So if you look at the private sector banks really in terms of net zero targets, except one, and of course we have not named, while a lot of this is in the public domain, more what we would like to focus on is the messages rather than individual actions. So except one, other banks in the private space have not really set up net zero targets. Of course, a lot of them caveat it under the carbon neutrality, but as we all understand, carbon neutrality is not really the net zero trajectory. When we look at also policy in terms of climate risk management, fairly good amount of work has been done. Also on ESG parameters in some of the lending decisions, there has been good amount of work. Having said that, if we look at the 5th column, this is something where I wanted you to focus attention on in terms of the total sustainable finance as percentage of the total lending book. It really stays in low decimals. So of course, we should read it as 2% in one of the banks, less than 5% in another, and less than 1% in. So, and a lot of them are not even disclosing this. So currently sustainable finance as percentage of the total loan book of a bank remains a very minute proportion of the overall loan book, and that's where a lot of work needs to happen. As we move from a mandatory reporting to a voluntary reporting, on the last 3 columns, if you look at the double materiality specifications under GRI 2021, we have most of the banks yet to scale up on that. Likewise, financed emissions, except for one sector, one private sector bank, and Niranjan clearly referred to that. They have been the first one to disclose. All the other banks are still to kind of adopt and even warm up to disclosures on financed emissions. And in true banking parlance, it's not just the organizational boundary, it's the access to capital which a bank really permits, and which is the universe which a bank needs to cover while reporting financed emissions or while reporting emissions. So leaving out the portfolio is really task not really well done, and financed emissions is an important piece which banks will have to really scale to. There is already a lot of guidance in terms of PCAF. Global banks, when we analyze a number of global banks, they have at least about 8 to 10 of them have gone out and reported financed emissions across hard to abate sector on voluntary basis. So I think this is something from an Indian parlance perspective, still a lot of work to be done. And likewise on the last part, TCFD aligned reporting across climate opportunities and risks, both in terms of strategy, parameters and governance mechanism. I think that's so the right three columns are really the one where a lot of work needs still to be done in the Indian banking parlance. If I turn the page to public sector banks, I think it's only more worrisome. I think public sector banks are still to play a catch-up role on most of the items. A lot of work to be done as compared to private sector banks. So at least private sector banks have taken a little bit of lead in terms of performing on the key parameters. If I look at just the third parameter in terms of a clear committee, board level committee having mandate of climate risk, I think except one where the risk committee has a mandate, while technically ESG committee as an expansion of CSR committee has been formed, but an exclusive mandate on managing and determining climate risk related mandate to a board committee. I think we are a significant distance away from that. So just to turn page on just the key summary, really on TCFD link reporting, long way to go, double materiality, long way to go, and scaling up sustainable finance, still material needs in terms of both the asset side and liability side. I think on the liability side, green deposits in small measure, green bonds in materially smaller measure as compared to the overall Indian corporate bond market. On the product side, while to name some of the banks, such as State Bank of India has a very wide-ranging portfolio of about 30 green and sustainable finance products, which is really kudos to the effort which the bank has taken in terms of scaling up product suite on sustainable finance. But in terms of the volumes, really a lot of work to still go on, not just from the banker's side, but from the regulatory and like Mr. Nair mentioned, on the government side to facilitate uplift of these products and penetration of the products. If I move to the last section, and I'm mindful of the time, I have a few minutes left. So if I compare and contrast what we really saw on the Indian banking parlance, and just to draw upon some of the examples and learnings from the global banks, and why I have named in this case all the banks, because these are really culled out of public disclosures. So I would not spend time on them, but really three standouts. I think most of the banks, including Citibank, committing $1 trillion, some of the likes of BNP Paribas, HSBC committing upwards of $200 billion on climate and sustainable finance. So actually banks have gone out and committed growth. So it's not just the risk lens, but really the loan book growth and the sectoral growth, including sectors which are excluded from financing. So a number of banks have had an exclusion list formally notified and disclosed in the public domain. Their own taxonomy, I was speaking to Shobna earlier, Stanchart Bank has their own taxonomy where they evaluate and guide in terms of what are the green and sustainable finance taxonomy. So that's the second area in terms of the taxonomy and architecture. The first area being huge sums of capital. The third is again voluntary leadership indicators in terms of diversity, inclusion and equity, which while we report in an Indian context, but really setting metrics and targets is something I have seen a lot of global banks, including Credit Agricole, Soc Gen, BNP Paribas, really scale up to. The last bit, of course, again, India needs to play a catch-up game on in terms of leveraging startups, technology and cloud-enabled mechanisms to reduce the environmental impact of the way banks operate. So in the conventional banking parlance, how banks operate in India, a lot of reform in terms of the basic operations, right from customer acquisition to loan documentation to loan disbursement. I think a lot of technology adaptation which can really facilitate in terms of the broader automation and credit extension agenda in a more sustainable means. So I think I leave some of the examples, but I think there are very solid examples in terms of how banks have adopted globally. The last two bits in terms of the global experience, which I would like to leave with the forum, is in terms of net zero commitments. We saw in India case, except one which has initiated the journey, I think most of the global banks have initiated the journey in terms of committing to a net zero target, and as I mentioned earlier, as part of that also being very candid in disclosing financed emissions, at least for hard to abate sectors. So I think these are some of the learnings that we happen to have from a global lens perspective. Turning the page, and I'll skip a few slides just in interest of time, but turning a few pages, some of the gaps that really exist from a India context perspective. Yeah, the next section, please. Yeah. Are in terms of how we enable, say, BRSR, which is a sector agnostic regulation and a disclosure framework, to be guided by some of the sectoral dynamics, particularly given the large banking spread that we happen to have. So gearing towards a sectoral based disclosure. Second is in terms of enabling climate and stress testing related parameters being built in. Third is in terms of lending decisions being really driven by consciousness on E, S, and G parameters. So of course, I have listed down more, but I think these are the three primary ones where really there are gaps from how Indian regulators can be a little more prescriptive in terms of how the banking system needs to evolve and prioritize some of the needs. If I look at, based on how some of the global frameworks, including PRB, including some of the frameworks such as sectoral guidance by SASB and the evolving guidance by ISSB, if I were to take some lessons from it, these are some of the things which Indian disclosure and reporting arena can really embrace towards. First is in terms of environmental risk, particularly in real estate and infrastructure sectors, in terms of how environmental risk can be adjudged, quantified and priced in. Second is in terms of incorporating ESG parameters in the loan disbursement process through having a scoring mechanism, a weightage mechanism in terms of how loans can be incentivized or disincentivized in terms of the ESG parameters. Discrimination lending disclosures in terms of saying that in terms of caste, creed, size, familiarity, there is no discrimination by a bank in terms of lending access to credit. Likewise, policies designed to enhance responsible banking and responsible behavior by a bank. So these are some of the areas based on global principles, reporting standards from a disclosure perspective become materially important. And turning to the very last page, in summary, I think from a bank lens perspective, if we move to the last page, please. Yeah, this is, if you look at the real bottom line, as one would say, apart from having the social agenda and the national agenda, social agenda being in terms of the community and driving equity, to the national agenda of enabling SDGs and G20 commitments, the banks have their own specific business growth agenda, and there really ESG fits in squarely in terms of how banks grow their book, how technology adoption happens, how ESG factors are integrated in credit decisioning, and how climate risk is factored in. Apart from that, stakeholder governance and sensitization in terms of the entire banking arena is really something which will drive towards the real bottom line of enabling all the three: social change, national priorities, and ensuring sustainable growth for the banking industry. With that, I'll bring this talk to a closure, and I'm mindful that we are up on the time. So thank you for being a great audience. Thank you.
So thank you for the wonderful presentation. May I request Chandrasekhar sir to present a memento to Mr. Kamdar as a token of love and affection. Thank you, sir.